This is a short presentation on the September 2017 topic of Patrick Lecture 5, which shorthand is what is truth, justice, freedom, religion, happiness. Now, the number 5 indicates that it's very early in the sequence. So I picked the lecture because I was intrigued by how so many large topics could be covered in a single lecture. And I also knew that in the original lectures in the beginning, the guide was starting a process that took a long time to unfold. And so I was looking at the possibility that there could be brevity in these early lectures that later might be expanded into a full lecture. And a full lecture can be interesting, but sometimes 2 paragraphs or a page and a half is more useful to outline the topic. What I found as I studied it, which is why I do this work, so that I can be informed, so that I can find my own understanding of the lectures. So trying to read it for a purpose of demonstrating, teaching, writing, presenting, pulls me into the material more deeply than just reading it for personal use, which can sometimes feel it doesn't feel engaging sometimes. So as I was reading it, I realized that the concept of duality really figures in here. Now, the guide doesn't talk about duality in depth until much later. And I've done study guides on these. Duality is covered primarily in Patrick Lecture 141, Unity and Duality, and also in Patrick Lecture 81, in how the earth plane manifests, or how we manifest on a dualistic plane. Not quite sure of the title at this moment, but it's also a study guide. And the reason duality figures here is when we talk about beautiful concepts and freedom, justice, truth, religion, these are beautiful concepts. On the earth plane, we are also dealing with the opposing idea. So for instance, let's start with number 1, happiness. The specter of happiness is always shadowed by the idea of unhappiness. And I'm going to talk about duality for just a few moments because it affects all of these concepts. Duality shows us, the study of duality shows us that the dualistic aspect always has a life and death component. So in duality, we really only see 2 poles of an argument. We don't see the gray in between. We see the extreme on one end and the extreme on the other. So when we talk about happiness, in the back of our mind, in our peripheral vision, we're sensing unhappiness. And dualistic thinking points out that we always want life. So if happiness represents life, then unhappiness represents death. So in seeking happiness, we are in effect running away from unhappiness. And yet the reality is that unhappiness is not death. If we overemphasize the value of happiness, we can begin to feel that unhappiness is the beginning of death. It may not be death, but we don't want to go there because then there could be misery and suffering and on and on and on. If we look at the spectrum in between happiness and unhappiness, a lot of that middle ground can be about not being happy. But not being classically happy does not mean that we're unhappy. It just means that we're not in a state that we would freely describe as completely happy in this moment. Most of us live our lives in the middle of that spectrum. It's not that we don't have a good life. We have a very good life. It may be great in specific moments. Happiness may expand, and we may feel completely flooded with happiness at given moments. But day in and day out, a lot of our lives are about not unhappy, not overwhelmingly happy. So in duality, what we're looking at is where we wind up with a forcing current that says happy is to be desired. It must be there all the time. I must taste it every day. And concurrently, unhappiness must never happen, must be avoided at all costs, is bad, presages doom and destruction. So the concept of happiness, once it comes into the earth plane, picks up the illusion of the earth plane, which is bad, good, right, wrong, happiness, unhappiness. So that will affect all these points, and I'll bring that up. In the concept of duality, one of the things we look for is if you're not happy and you become unhappy, what does that really mean? Once we examine unhappiness, unhappiness is not the end of the world. But if we're frightened of it, we never look at it. And when we don't look at it, it becomes something to be avoided at all costs. It becomes something unexamined, unanalyzed. And it actually is more fearful, becomes more fearful than it would be if we looked at it and said, it is not a state that I embrace, but it won't kill me if it happens. And that's the and here, where happiness and unhappiness can coexist. And I'd like to wait a little bit more, meaning I'd like to put a bit more weight in my life on becoming happy than in experience unhappiness. But if I experience unhappiness, it is not the end of the world. So that's the concept of duality. So when we look at happiness in Patrick Lecture 5, the challenge is that we really do know happiness from unhappiness. And the way we know that is holistically, we bring in the other concepts, which means freedom, truth, justice, a sense of inner knowing the difference. So again, I may not be happy, but I can say, I may be able to say I'm not happy. I may also be able to say at the same time I'm not unhappy. I can say I'm happy and not necessarily say, and I will never be unhappy. That's a bit confusing, pardon me. What I'm trying to say is we know the difference. We may not know exactly where we are on the scale, but we can guess how far away we are from the extremes. So if I have in my life a disharmony, in other words, something's bothering me, I may not be happy about that. But just because there's a disharmony in my life does not make me unhappy. So again, the guide is inviting us to use our inner knowing to be able to tell the difference with an inner knowing, rather than trying to put external guideposts out there. If I have this much money, I will be happy, is a way to try to put a goalpost on a feeling that doesn't work for more than a few moments. There's a saying in business that if you give somebody a raise, they'll be happy on the first or second paycheck, and then it becomes wallpaper. Then that's just what they make. We adapt. We grow into a situation, and then it no longer brings us the same joy as the first or second time we experience it. So happiness is different from my interest was piqued or wow, that sounds exciting. Happiness on some level can be boring because it's just a pleasant state of mind to some extent. The guide talks about selfish versus unselfish happiness and says, are you willing to sacrifice the least bit for anyone else? If you are not willing to sacrifice the least bit for anyone else, then the invitation here is to look at whether your happiness is very selfish. That I'm focusing on things that make me happy instead of looking for things that create happiness for me and the people who surround me. Even if momentarily I'm not happy with something, it helps other people, they're happy, and my happiness will come over time. He says, can you believe that you will receive in return 100-fold measure of what you have given? So in other words, if you give something out, do you truly believe that you will get back more than you give? Now, when I read that section, I immediately thought I need to bring in the spiritual principles. Spiritual principles are from a whole series of articles and papers written later, featured in Patrick Lecture 171, again, this study guide. And the spiritual principles are a digest, a condensation of many, many times when the guide talks about spiritual law. The guide never actually codified that, so some of his students, some of his helpership students in the early days codified that and wrote up a paper called Spiritual Principles. And they listed 9 of them that are a general overview. People say, well, how many are there? Well, the guide mentions many, so there are thousands perhaps. But the point is not to find all the rules and all the regulations of spirit, but to attempt to find a central understanding of them where you can not only honor them and use them as guideposts or signs, but to also give you an indication as to when you're out of alignment. So the way I teach it is that if you attempt to bend a spiritual law, you read these 9 principles, which are included with the study guide. If you read these 9 principles and you say, I like 8 of them, but one of them I don't understand or I don't agree with, the invitation is to see where that may be the place where some negativity is showing up in you. And it shows up in one place, but it actually affects all of the principles and all of your life. And that happens to be one of the spiritual principles. That lack of awareness in one aspect of your life will affect the rest of your life eventually. You cannot cordon off. I cannot say, I will only be negative when talking to customer service when they have sold me a bad product. In that area, I can be rude and angry and just vent without any sense of responsibility whatsoever. But everywhere else in my life, I will be responsible and respectful. That doesn't work. Giving yourself an outlet to be mean, inconsiderate, will spread eventually to the rest of your life. And a denial that you are doing that, the denial will also spread into other aspects of your life. So this is an example of a spiritual principle. And what I found is that these 4 topics wound up using all 9 of them. And so they were a good opportunity to demonstrate what a spiritual principle means. So I include them with the study guide. So when you say, when the guide says, can you believe that you will receive in return 100-fold measure of what you have given? One of the spiritual principles that would deal with this is the law of cause and effect. So in that spiritual principle, think of it like Newtonian physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That the law of cause and effect is about karma, that when you put negativity out into the world, it will eventually make its way back to you. What the guide teaches is sometimes you might put out negativity in one lifetime and not receive its effects until the next lifetime, so you can't connect the dots. This is a very difficult thing for people to deal with. As you become more aware of your own self, about putting out negativity or behaving in a negative way, and then seeing the effects of that negativity come back at you, as cause and effect come closer and closer and closer together, we can begin to connect the dots. We can begin to understand my happiness and your happiness are connected. Another example of this, which is a little abstract, but maybe relevant today, is that many, many countries over many, many centuries have done things that generate, I'm going to call it heat and friction on the planet. Shoving people around, creating false borders, supporting governments that are in our interest versus somebody else's interest. All the activity that has happened on the planet may be coalescing in a particular time period such as now, when there is a lot of global strife. And it's beginning to erupt. Now, we can't go back 300, 500 years and change what has happened. So there is friction, there is strife. But the opportunity here is to understand cause and effect, to begin to see that superimposing governments onto people creates strife that can simmer for decades or centuries before it erupts. So that superimposing governments is not a good idea, even though it may serve our interests. Another example, once again, slightly esoteric, but cause and effect is prevalent, or it's present everywhere. Depends on what your interest is as to where you find it. There's an idea today that the stock market is not actually serving the economies that it was meant to serve, because it winds up over time, doesn't happen immediately, but over time it winds up serving the interests of the shareholders versus the interests of the community. So instead of having a company that is working on ethical principles, you wind up having companies that are working on the basis of how can we make our shares more valuable? How can we give money back to specific people at the expense of others? And these are examples where in modern life, the stress we encounter, the dilemmas we encounter in life have been built over long periods of time through complex human interactions that no one person may be responsible for. And yet the unhappiness that results is something that we all get the effect of that. The purpose of pointing that out is not that we should go fix everything, but that there is a spiritual principle involved. And what Pathwork tries to teach is that if we accept that spiritual principle of cause and effect, and we then begin to watch what negativity we put out and temper that and analyze and process that negativity so that we are putting out less negativity into our daily life, the world that we actually do affect, that puts less negativity out into the global energy system. This is very new agey. Puts less negative energy out into the global atmosphere, and we can begin to heal. It's a long-term process, but it still comes back to you and your life. If you are broody and irritable and prone to temper tantrums or temper outbursts, it is very likely that you're not creating a lot of happiness around you, and that comes back to you. So there's a law of cause and effect that operates in your individual life circumstances that can be valuable for you to understand, that affects your happiness. One of the other laws is the law of brotherhood. So what hurts me hurts you. The fact that you may not recognize that it hurts you, or the effect may not be felt by you for 20 years, doesn't change the fact that what hurts me hurts you. What the law of brotherhood is about is an understanding that if I hurt myself, I hurt you. It's not okay for me to hurt myself and say nobody cares but me. It doesn't work that way. This is a spiritual practice, pathwork is. And in a spiritual practice, we need to see beyond tit for tat. I spend $1, I get $1, is not spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is more about I am generous, I give. And I find that my life flows more easily because of my giving. And part of that is that true giving involves true receiving. So now we're back to the topic of selfish versus unselfish happiness. When I am selfishly happy, I am not giving. And I also cannot receive. Even when I am selfishly giving, I am giving to you in order to get. There's a forcing current in that giving and a demand in wanting something back for it that makes my giving selfish or my receiving selfish. So these are elements that affect our overall happiness. The invitation here is to explore and examine and see how we can improve our own lives as well as the lives of the people around us so that we are all a little bit happier. Another aspect of this is that spirituality is not about counting earth in earth plane measures. So happiness is not about feet and inches or centimeters and meters. Spiritual happiness is, it can't be calculated, but it can be felt. So anytime you find yourself gauging your happiness on earth plane measures, consider that that this is not how happiness is measured. It's not how it's created, not how it's measured. And that any reliance on measuring happiness may wind up destroying the very thing that you're looking for. Now, I picked 4 topics because I divide the study guide into 4 sections. So the next topic I chose was freedom. The aspects of freedom are the same as happiness. There's a saying that I grew up with, and that is that my freedom extends just to the tip of your nose. That I can wave my hand around until I impact your nose. So I have a certain amount of freedom to do what I please until I impact your freedom. The guide says if you want freedom for selfish reasons, you will remain chained inside. And that goes along with how far my freedom extends. When people say they want the freedom to act, there can be a place where they refuse to consider how that impacts the actions and freedoms of others. So we can say, hey, my fist never touched your nose. But when I misbehave in a classroom, for instance, and I consume all the oxygen in the room, and I take up all the time of the teacher misbehaving and acting out, I am taking something away from the other students in the room. I am impacting their freedom to learn by demanding that there be no limits on my freedom to express myself and or learn. So the guide statement, if you want freedom for selfish reasons, you will remain chained inside. Screaming, take care of me, does not make us free. Again, if you look at happiness and you look at freedom, there is an openness to freedom. There is an openness to happiness that we can feel into more than we can quantify. The concept of freedom brings up the principle, the law of paying the price. People very often react to the law of paying the price. They act as if it's a human transaction, and yeah, I paid $1 and I didn't get happiness in return. Well, happiness isn't bought at any price. So you're attempting to control happiness with something you have in your pocket, rather than trying to open to happiness or give happiness, and therefore be concurrently open to receiving happiness. So with freedom, the law of paying the price might show up this way. In the United States, we have a concept called civil disobedience. And what that concept means is that it's technically not against the law to break the law. It is not against the law to break the law. It is against the law to try to avoid the consequences. So if I rob a bank, the consequences are I will be charged with robbing a bank. If I don't run away, then they just charge me with what I did and they take me to trial, and that's what I did. In civil disobedience, what we do is we break a law, we make a roadblock. Protesters will block a road. And there's a law that says you can't just stand in the road and block a road. So in civil disobedience, we break the law and say yes to the consequences for the purpose of getting our day in court, for the purpose of asking the judicial system to review the law and see if the law is fair or not, and potentially throw it out. So back to freedom. I have the freedom to break the law. I have the freedom to try to avoid the consequences, but that's going to increase my jail sentence. So I have the freedom to try to avoid spiritual law, but that doesn't mean I am avoiding it. It just means that I may be delaying the cause and effect process of spiritual law. So what I'm getting at in this is that, going back to the original example, I have the freedom to threaten you by putting my fist next to your face. There are consequences to that. You may decide not to engage with me. You may decide not to have a relationship with me. You may decide to turn me into the police for threatening you. And there may be a law on the books about threatening people. And you can become entangled in court systems, whether or not the law is fair. So the insistence on freedom is a selfish kind of insistence. Instead of saying, where can we all be more free to develop ourselves, to feel our potential, to enjoy more happiness, and minimize the effect on other people so that my happiness does not take anything away from you, does not remove your ability to be happy. That's the kind of freedom that the guide is talking about. The other concept here is that, and this works for all four topics, is freedom very often is an attitude. And you may have noticed this in your life, that some people don't feel as constrained by social norms as others. I will admit to being somewhat constrained by social norms. I don't like being impolite. I don't like being rude. I don't like being pushy. I don't like being known as an irritable or mean person. So I try to stay within social norms. That's my choice. And then I look at someone else, and they seem to feel free to express themselves however they feel in the moment without being concerned about how other people react to that. They have a freedom that I don't have. I'm not sure I want that freedom, but it helps me to look at where I may be giving up my ability to express my feelings for a false equivalency. Just because I am not happy To express that does not necessarily mean it will make someone else unhappy. But what I'm saying here is that freedom can be an attitude. And that attitude can be, I wish to explore my freedom. If I bump into you, I will apologize and I will try to diverge so that I'm not impinging upon you. But exploring my freedom will naturally take me into areas that are not as well known as staying within for instance, a social norm. What I admire about the person who just says what they think is that I have not explored some aspects of being present with other people. I have not explored being more honest, more real, more present. By staying behind this curtain of social norm, I have inhibited my freedom as if I needed to exchange my freedom for your approval. When I see someone else behave more freely, my envy of them is partly due to a realization that I am imposing something on me that doesn't need to be imposed. What I'm getting at is that attitude is real freedom. And attitude is something that you can control 100%. No one can control your attitude without your consent. And I think that that's what, we have that as children, but they were quickly taught not to have that attitude. And we need to regain it as adults. I can be happy under very trying circumstances. Somebody else doesn't choose to be happy. They can choose to be unhappy. But that's a choice. I can choose what attitude I wish to have. And my attitude will determine how I see things, how I understand things. So it would impact how I see whether I'm happy or not. It would impact how I feel, whether I feel free or not. And here's a personal example of that. I remember I was having a discussion, and somebody I know very well was in the room with me. It's 3 people. And the third person asked if I had led a happy life. And I answered yes. And the second person, who knew me rather well, looked at me and said, "Excuse me," because that person knew about a lot of the tribulations that I have undergone in my life. And from their perspective, I have not had a happy life all the way through. That's true. I have not. However, I am at peace with my life. So today I am happy, and I was willing to say I have had a happy life because I don't feel that there are places in my life where I have not looked to understand what was going on at that time. My attitude about my life determines how I view my life. And it is just as easy to look at a relatively good life and declare yourself unhappy about it as it is to look at a troublesome life and say, I'm at peace with that, I'm happy with my life. So these are on some degree subjective and yet not. There is truth here. Truth is subject number 4. So I'm going to talk for a second about justice. Now, when it came to the topic of justice, again, one of the reasons I teach this work is as I lead discussions and listen to what people share, I get a much deeper understanding of the concept. So when we were working with the idea of justice, I got that there are 2 elements that came up with justice. One came up immediately for me, and one took a while. The first that came up with me is that justice is love. Spiritual justice is love. And human justice attempts to mimic that. When we dispense justice, we're attempting to make the punishment fit the crime, meaning we are trying to find a consequence to impose on someone that helps them become aware of the ramifications of their crime and why not to do that, just like we treat children. So when a child spills its milk, it may be an accident, it may be carelessness. The 5th time they spill their milk, we may notice that they're acting out at the table, and we may send them to their room for a timeout for the acting out. Justice with parents is attempting to find something that brings the child's attention to their act, that helps them reflect upon it and understand the consequences. And once they do, presuming that it's a reasonable request, don't spill your milk at the table. Once they do understand the cause and effect, that they would naturally not do it. Who would spill their milk for the sheer fun of spilling milk? Especially if it caused your mother consternation. But a small child doesn't understand cause and effect. And they don't understand how their actions affect other people. How spilling your milk makes your mother have to clean it up, so we're going to be late leaving for the next thing we're going to do. This is what a child learns in life. So-called adults, meaning people who have passed the age of majority and who are allowed to do what they please, are not necessarily social and or spiritually adult yet. There may be aspects of immaturity there. Therefore, in our justice system, we're attempting to find a way to bring to their attention that this has consequences in the real world, and that we have to stop those consequences from happening. So at some point, we have to impinge upon their rights to make sure other people's rights are respected. Perhaps you can see that there is love here, or there is a desire to be loving here. But a justice system is too big to be as fair as hopefully a family unit can be. We just don't have the time to look at every person's unique circumstances. And that is presuming that we could find the truth of their circumstances within the time that we have. So we have justice, we have truth, we have love, we have time. And all these things need to happen in a reasonable period of time for a justice system to operate. So, the spiritual concept of justice is what we're trying to bring here on earth. But we don't have the tools that spirit has. We're trapped by time. We're trapped by not knowing the truth of a situation. And we have finite tools that we can use to address a situation. So justice on the earth plane is difficult. What happens is that we start demanding justice even though we don't have all the tools in place. We don't have the truth, we don't have the time, we don't have the means, but we still want justice. And this leads us past justice into retribution, restitution. Retribution means we want to vent our feelings, want to get back at someone. And restitution meaning we want things put back the way they were. Some things can be put back the way they were, some things cannot. On the earth plane, we may not be satisfied. No matter how good our justice system can be, it still can't return peace of mind to us. So for instance, if we are burglarized, they can catch the burglar, they can put him in jail, he can reform, everything's wonderful, except we're still nervous at night. Little noises bother us. Where is the restitution for our peace of mind? Now, our peace of mind may have been an illusion, but our illusion is gone. There is no power on the earth to bring back our illusion of safety. That has been broken. What Pathwork is about is trying to find out whether there might be value in that. that perhaps we were living in denial. Perhaps we were living in a fantasy. It will never happen to me. I don't have to take precautions. I don't have to double check my locks. God will protect me. Some form of denial that got broken. What is the value there? Now, we're getting a little bit far afield from justice, but what I am saying is justice on the earth plane cannot give full restitution for what is taken when a principle, a rule, a law is broken. We can only have partial solutions. And when there is a forcing current to get full restitution or to include retribution, revenge, this is not justice anymore. And perhaps you can see where this is also not love. This is about selfishness or a desire to vent rather than trying to find justice. The laws that come into effect here are the law of lack of awareness, where lack of awareness in one area of your life prohibits awareness in another. So if you cannot see the harm you're causing by being overly cruel in your application of justice, it will ripple through your society and come back at you. When we treat prisoners as enemies and just lock them up, instead of trying to enact true justice, then we wind up with very angry people when and if they get out, and or very angry family members who believe that their loved ones have been taken away from them without due cause or without the actual purpose of rendering justice for revenge. So law of lack of awareness in one area of your life prohibits awareness in the other. Cause and effect become disconnected. And when cause and effect are disconnected, then we complain, this happened to me out of the blue, I don't know what that's about, the world is a chaotic place. That's what it feels like when we can't sense into a deeper reality of cause and effect. And then there's the law of living in truth, and that's facing life and recognizing what is. So using the tiny example of if you're burglarized and if you're lucky enough that the burglar gets caught so that you feel safe about that particular person invading your space. And you also realize that you're nervous at night. It is important to not fantasize or pretend or deny that that's not true, but to deal with what is. This is my new reality. I don't remember having invited it, but here it is. I need to face where I am now and find help, perhaps. Find therapy, find a support group. Somebody might say, well, you can't get a support group for every little thing that goes wrong with you. But as I was speaking today with someone in one of the groups, that's what friendship is for. Friendship is free therapy. Therapy where we both support each other and we listen to each other and we share and we feel a part of a community, whether small or large. So when we recognize what is, part of that may include finding groups, finding friends, talking, sharing, writing, whatever that is, but to truly respect where we are at the moment, instead of yearning for, gosh, I wish that hadn't happened, and not dealing with the after effects. So that little piece was about justice. And then we get to truth. Now, one would think that truth would have come first, except that sometimes, and this is what I notice in the lectures, sometimes the guide seems to feel that we have to start at the end and come to the beginning. That sometimes we need to talk about other topics that don't seem as thorny before we can finally come to a very difficult topic. And truth is difficult. Now, truth is difficult because of time. The guide says that truth is permanent, never changing. The form is unchangeable, yet in constant flux. It is flexible and organic. How can that be? Remember that we're talking about a spiritual truth here. When it manifests on the earth plane, we add the element of time. So that if truth is unchangeable and yet in constant flux, we may sense into the unchangeable part, but not feel into the constant flux part. And what we do is we try to capture truth. I can wrap my head around this piece of truth. Can't figure that part out. I can capture this piece of truth. And so I'm going to focus on this. This makes me feel happy. This makes me feel that justice is possible. This makes me feel that I can continue to be free. All these other elements may come from saying this is the truth. But when we fixate on a portion of the truth that we can understand, what we're really saying is, I don't want to take a year to figure out the truth. I don't want to take a decade to figure out the truth. I need the truth in a week. I need the truth in this conversation. I need this truth before December. So without realizing it, we're putting deadlines on the truth. And the truth can't have deadlines put on it. The truth is unchangeable and yet in constant flux. The example that I found today on this is that I'm watching the current series on Vietnam, which is an 18-hour series. And at one point, or at many points actually, the series talks about events that happened in the 60s and the 70s, which is, give or take, between 40 and 60 years ago. 50s, 60s, and 70s. Where we got information only 20 years ago. And yet we had to make decisions back then. People had to decide how they felt. They had to decide how they felt. They needed to decide, do I protest? Do I join the army? Do I join the government? What statement do I make today? They had to do that with the truth as they knew it at that time. And yet in large cultural events, there are many, many aspects to truth. And they sometimes stay hidden for decades. And once they emerge, a lot of times we're stuck on the truth we decided 40, 50, 60 years ago. And we're not open to re-examining that truth based on information that had been hidden from us at the time. Not that it didn't exist. It was hidden from us at the time. This is an example of what the guide talks about. Spiritual truth is unchangeable and yet in constant flux, where we may need to expand and expand and expand our understanding of a situation based over time, and not be afraid to revisit decisions that we made based on the limited knowledge that we had. So we may only know a portion of the truth. We may need to act upon that truth. And if we keep in mind that later we learn something where this needs to be re-examined, to have the courage and the character, courage, wisdom, and love, to do what we can to revisit decisions that we have made when we find that they were based only upon partial truth. Now, I talked about a very large cultural event. Let me bring this down to our personal lives. Again, in one of the meeting discussions, we talked about friendships. And In a friendship, you may feel a certain way towards a friend. That feeling may be very strong, and the friendship is strong because of it. A feeling of connection. I'm trying to stay away from specifics. Just a feeling of connection with your friend. Then something happens, and your feeling changes, but you're not fully aware of it. But things never are the same again. And a week, a month, a year, a decade later, you realize that the friendship is now hollow. It is not alive and vibrant anymore. Something left the friendship. Rather than try to blame ourselves for not recognizing the moment something changed, instead realize the invitation is to realize that truth takes time to unfold. But once it does, to recognize the deeper truth in a situation instead of trying to insist upon an old form. So to be more specific, we were talking about, and my experience also, is that you can have a friendship for a decade, and then something happens and it just dies. But it's like a limb on a tree. It just dies slowly, and you don't realize it's dying until one day some pressure is put on the friendship and it breaks. The truth in that situation is that the death of the friendship began a long time ago. You may even be able to reconstruct the moment. And yet there's a process of dying that is also important, so that you know it's irreversible. I hope I'm not being too abstract here. But what I am saying is that the truth is that there was a revelation in one moment, and then there was an effect of that revelation. The revelation, the truth, is not the key element. It's not the only element in life. Part of life is to experience the effect of that revelation upon your life. To notice a relationship becoming more brittle, less alive, until finally one day you say, the relationship no longer serves me. It's very likely the relationship no longer serves the other person either. And it is time to let go. That's, I think, what we mean when we say a deeper truth. There's a truth at a moment of revelation. And then there is a deeper truth of acceptance. We're not ready to do the acceptance at the moment of the revelatory moment. And that's the positive aspect of time. We may need a little time to get used to it. It's not true to jump to a conclusion just because something happened and say, therefore, I must do this. It can be more honest to wait and let things play out. One more example would be that someone spoke about relationship, and they said, I am looking at a relationship and it looks quite promising, and I wonder what's possible here. In that small question, what is possible here, was eagerness for it to go in a specific direction. There's a truth in the eagerness. And if we're not careful, the truth in the eagerness could overwhelm, could mask the truth that that's not where this relationship will best serve you. Sometimes a relationship best serves in one way as a friendship versus an intimate relationship. Or sometimes a friendship best serves you as a casual friendship rather than a bestie, a best friend relationship. So to push for a best friend relationship, and instead of accepting that this relationship is a little off on, and given its freedom, it can serve you very well there. But pushing it towards something that you feel a need for does not serve the underlying truth of the connection you have with the other person. So perhaps you can see where truth is complex, justice is complex, freedom is complex, and happiness is complex. And invitation is to find your inner knowing about these things. So thank you for listening. Discussion of Patrick Lecture 5, which discusses happiness, freedom, justice, and truth. Thank you.